Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. My name is Juan and welcome back to another book review. So today we're going to talk about the classic novel Jane Eyre by the English writer Charlotte Bronte. I'm excited to talk about Jane Eyre because it happens to be one of my all-time favorite novels. I also recommend Jane Eyre as one of the novels you must read if you want to get into classics. For more classic recommendations, check out my recent video on where to start with classics if you haven't already. If you appreciate my reviews and would like to show your support, please give this review a like and subscribe to my channel. That way, this video will get to more people who might enjoy it too. Thanks. So Jane Eyre is one of the best-known English novels from the Victorian period. I don't know exactly why, but this novel has always spoken to me very loudly. I'm not ashamed to admit that I only read Jane Eyre after watching one of those cheesy Sunday night TV adaptations by the BBC. I don't think that show was really all that good, but it made me pick up a novel I had never particularly felt attracted to. So Jane Eyre was first published in 1847, and the original full title is Jane Eyre, an autobiography, which is interesting because it gives us an idea of what to expect from the novel, at least in terms of how the story is going to be told. Charlotte Bronte used her male pen name Currer Bell to publish the novel, and indeed her other work. Now, pen names are still common to this day, but Charlotte Bronte used a male one because she did not want to be judged softly, which she thought was the case with female authors of her time. Now, we have long known that Currer Bell was Charlotte Bronte, so let's forget about that silly male pseudonym and talk about Charlotte Bronte. So Charlotte Bronte was originally from Yorkshire in the north of England, and she lived between 1816 and 1855. So she was only 38 years old when she died. She was very young. Now, Charlotte Bronte, as most people know, was the eldest of the three Bronte sisters. Her younger sisters, Anne and Emily, are also well-known writers in their own right. Now, Charlotte Bronte works as a teacher, and I think she must have poured some of that experience into her novel Jane Eyre. So let's talk about her book. As usual, the first part of this review will contain no spoilers. So the first part of this review is going to be suitable for people who haven't read the novel, and also, of course, those who have, right? The second part of this review will contain spoilers, but I will make it clear when we get there, so you can stop watching if you haven't read the novel yet, okay? So Jane Eyre is a coming-of-age story, or a Bildungsroman. The novel is told in the first person by the main character, Jane Eyre herself, hence the reference to autobiography in the full title that I mentioned earlier. Now, the story begins with Jane as a child and ends with her as an adult. So the novel spans a few very important years in the life of the main character. Jane is an orphan. Those Victorians loved orphans in fiction, and she's the kind of character I think that is designed to foster readers' empathy. You are supposed to root for Jane throughout the whole novel. And, you know, I must say that Jane got my empathy from the beginning of the novel. I even felt a level of identification with her. I don't know if this is a very personal, highly subjective thing, or if other readers also identify with Jane, but I do think that you need to feel at least a degree of identification with Jane to enjoy this novel. And I suspect that people who don't like Jane Eyre so much feel like that because for whatever reason they do not see themselves even a little bit in her, but I could be totally wrong about that. You tell me. Regardless, I think you need to root for the heroine for this novel to work for you. I really do believe that. So what makes Jane the character so appealing to me? Well, she's smart, Jane is an intelligent person, and she is honest. She must deal with a lot. In the novel, Charlotte Bronte makes her heroine go through hell in the novel, yet through it all, Jane always is herself. She asserts herself even in the most adverse circumstances, and I think that's just so admirable. And I think that continues to speak to us. Like many people, you know, Jane faces inequality. She's poor and she's a woman, so the double whammy. But Jane never conforms. She's not submissive at any point in the novel. Her belief in equality is unshakable, and that makes her an example to us all even today. Sure, we no longer live in Victorian times, thankfully, but it would be disingenuous to say that we have reached full equality, right? However, there is an aspect, just one aspect of inequality that Charlotte Bronte doesn't address in her novel, which is racial inequality. But that is something Jean Rhys addressed in her great novel White Sargasso Sea, which is a sequel to Jane Eyre written in the 20th century. And if everything goes well, I will review White Sargasso Sea next week, so keep an eye out for it if you want to hear my thoughts on the post-colonial sequel to Jane Eyre. The other main character that even people who have not read Jane Eyre often know about is Edward Rochester, the famous Mr. Rochester. The romance between Mr. Rochester and Jane is at the center of the narrative, sure, but I'm not going to get into it yet to avoid spoilers, so don't worry about that. Now, Mr. Rochester is a passionate character with a mysterious past, and that all makes him, I think, irresistible as a character, and it makes him irresistible to Jane as well. Now, Mr. Rochester keeps a dark secret that keeps the reader on tenterhooks for much of the novel. Jane Eyre has romance, gothic elements, suspense. To me, it is one of the most readable Victorian novels. Definitely one of the most readable Victorian novels I have read, and every time I read it, I have a great time. Now, some passages can be a bit strange for us, I think, but overall, I also think that the story would make sense to most readers now, and it is not really a difficult book to read at all. In fact, I don't think there is anything particularly challenging in Jane Eyre, which is why it is going to be one of my rare blank recommendations to everyone watching this video. And this is pretty much all I can say about Jane Eyre without spoiling the plot for people who have not read it yet. So I am going to talk more about the plot and go deeper into some of the themes of the novel now. So if you have not read Jane Eyre yet, or would like to avoid any spoilers, you should stop watching this video right about now. I will see you again, I hope, soon for another book review. Okay, and for those of you who are still watching, I am not going to summarize the whole plot now. This is something I have done for the last few books I have reviewed, but I'm not convinced it really works, and it does take a lot of effort to put that together. So instead of summarizing the whole plot of the novel, I will just talk about sections that I think are the most relevant or interesting, okay? But do let me know if you have strong feelings about this, about my summarizing the plot, and whether you would like me to continue including a full summary of the plot of the future books I review on here. I do feel like most of you don't care for that, but I could be wrong, so please let me know. Anyway, the novel begins with Jane as a child, and I must say that this is my least favorite part of the novel, but I think it's just because I don't like reading about children particularly. I think I prefer my main characters to be adults, but I would say that the novel begins quite strong, okay? Jane is an orphan who lives with a mean aunt, Mrs. Reeds. Jane's life is so horrible that she's relieved to be sent to boarding school. That should tell you enough. But things do not really get better at school. Throughout the novel, in fact, Jane goes through a lot, but it is particularly hard for me to read about a child being in pain. And I think this is why I am less fond of the early chapters of the novel. Jane Eyre gets better for me when she's hired by Mr. Rochester to take care of his love child, Adele. I love the novel from that point on. I like how Jane falls secretly in love with her boss. There is something really appealing about that slightly wrong relationship. But what really fascinates me is how the roles are often switched between Jane and Edward Rochester. Even though Rochester is this mysterious manly man, very often it is Jane who saves him. Like, he grows dependent on her rather than the other way around, and I find that so refreshing. Because despite being a rich man, so wealthy and a man, Edward ends up totally dependent on Jane, who was born poor and female, and I just love that. But let's go back to the plot, okay? So at some point, Jane saves Edward from a fire, and that fire has to do with the dark secret that he has been keeping. When Edward was younger, he went to Jamaica, where he married a local woman named Bertha Mason. Bertha is presented to us as demented. This is why Edward has her locked up in the cellar. Now, Bertha is the person who causes that fire, and when Jane finds out later on about her existence, she runs away. Now, Jane finds out about Edward's wife on her wedding day with him. So, Charlotte Bronte really knew how to write for impact. The first time I read Jane Eyre, I was shocked when I got to that part when we find out Edward Rochester's secrets. And I had seen the TV adaptation, so I should have seen it coming, really. But I guess that's one of the benefits of not having a sharp memory, I guess. I hated Jane being away from Edward in that part of the novel, but not as much as I hated St. John. Now, who is St. John? St. John is this minister who becomes Jane's benefactor while she's away from Edward, and they're also cousins. So in so many ways, St. John is the opposite of Edward. On paper, St. John seems all right, but in reality, he's cold and ambitious. While Edward sounds all wrong on paper, he's passionate and a loving man in reality. Well, that's if you're willing to overlook his relationship with the mad woman in the attic, but I'll talk more about that in my review of White Sargasso Sea next week. For now, let's pretend that it is okay to lock up someone with mental health issues up in the cellar. Even though St. John and Jane are cousins, he wants to marry her and take her to India, where he's planning to go as a Christian missionary. She refuses to marry him, but she's game for going to India. St. John tries to convince her, but that only makes Jane realize that she loves Edward after all. So what does she do? She goes back to him. But what she finds when she gets there is not exactly what she had left on their wedding day. During the time Jane was away, Bertha burned down the house and died in the process. Poor Bertha. Edward lost his eyesight and one of his hands in the fire as well. But true love doesn't care about any of that, so reader, she married him. We later find out that Rochester recovers his eyesight partially and they have a child and they live happily ever after. And, I guess I have just pretty much summarized a lot of the plot here, but I have lived out some key stuff, believe me, particularly about the early parts of the narrative, like, for instance, Jane's school friendship with a girl who dies of consumption as a child, which is heartbreaking, or the stuff about Jane's cousins, and a lot more. Something I really like about Jane Eyre is what it has to say about love. Jane grows up unloved and I guess unloving. That's until she meets Edward. And later she must choose between him and St. John. I think she doesn't want to marry St. John largely because she has grown somewhat dependent on him. She met him when she fled Edward and she had nothing at that point. She was only able to survive because of St. John's charity. Someone like Jane would only accept that as a temporary solution. And she accepted it gracefully, don't get me wrong, but she was not willing to tie herself up to someone just because that someone helped her at some point. And she would never accept being dependent on a man for life. That idea, even now, is almost revolutionary. There are so many people who are dependent or codependent in real life. I don't know if her relationship with Edward becomes one of codependency when they get married, because the novel does not really go into that. And you can only judge a novel from what is in the actual text, so at least we can say that there is no codependency between them in the novel. We do know, as an aside, that Edward recovers his eyesight partially, so I guess he wouldn't have remained fully dependent on Jane forever. I also love how the novel deals with social class differences by having a protagonist who is poor and, from her own description of herself, ugly. This is a Victorian novel. Social class structures were incredibly rigid in England at the time, and I feel like Charlotte Bronte is almost subversive in this novel by having such an intelligent and strong main character who is both poor and a woman, and I love that. It's not something I've seen in other Victorian novels, and I think it's one of the reasons I always enjoy reading Jane Eyre so much and why it continues to speak to me. Another thing that speaks to me in this novel is how precarious Jane's situation is. I'm talking about her finances. For instance, she keeps moving between different places. She doesn't really have a home to go to, but that doesn't seem to affect her. I think a lot of readers now could see themselves in that aspect of the novel. For instance, I have moved around quite a bit in my time. I don't have a family home either. I'm not an orphan, thankfully, but I lived in 3 or 4 different places growing up, and as an adult, you know, I've lost count on the different places I have lived in. It is hard to see something like this so well represented in fiction, and I think that is one of the ways in which I liken myself to Jane, you know, despite the obvious differences in time period, gender, or location between us, right? But now I am dying to hear what you have to say about Jane Eyre, so please let me know your thoughts if you have read the novel. And if you haven't read it yet, let me know what you think of my review, whether you want to now read the novel because of it or not, whether I have completely put you off. And if you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends on social media. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Bookish Islander, so you know, we can talk about books on other platforms too. This is all from me. I hope to see you again very soon for another book review or bookish video. Bye for now.